the raw, brutal wind that day was the first thing that lied. I remember stepping off the small supply vessel onto the slick, moss-covered rocks of the island, and the true terror began when the wind stopped, replaced by a silence that proved the horror was not the sea but what happened inside the walls. I was sent to find a simple distress signal, but I found the opposite. An absolute, unnatural stillness in a place that should have been chaotic. Our small team immediately headed for the station, the only structure visible beneath the scudding clouds. The first clue was a profound psychological shock. The building was secured, bolted against the constant gales, and the door was latched from the inside. We forced the heavy lock, and the contrast between the external gale and the internal stillness was immediate and unnerving. The interior was a terrifying tableau of suspended life. A half-eaten meal sat on the table. A book lay open on a chair, marked with a pair of spectacles. The fireplace contained the faint warmth of recently banked coals. This wasn't an abandonment. It was an instantaneous, inexplicable vanishing. Every single protocol established for a sudden emergency had been violated. No distress signal had been sent. The logbook was open, the last entry made hours before, calm and mundane. The greatest psychological shock was the lack of bodies. The initial tension of the investigation, the hunt for survivors or corpses, was replaced by the chilling dread of an absolute void. I searched every room, every closet, every bunk, confirming the impossible truth. All personnel were gone. The tension in the air was so thick it was physical. It felt like the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment, knowing they were coming right back. But the scene screamed violence, not accident. We found a heavy chair overturned near the main communication desk, indicating a sudden, sharp struggle, and in one corner, near a filing cabinet, a strange, precise slash mark, as if someone had used a blade to mark the wall before being dragged away. I knew then that the silence was not the seas. It was the chilling, enforced silence of a perfect crime. The island, which I knew was built to isolate men from the world, had now become the tomb for the human truth. The greatest tragedy of this case wasn't the silence we found. It was the absolute isolation that made the horror possible. I had to move past the shocking void of the abandoned station and understand the environment itself. Because on this island, the landscape was not a backdrop. It was the primary suspect. This was not a place built for human community. It was a structure designed for survival against nature, which unwittingly became the perfect psychological crime lab. I walked the perimeter, feeling the wind tear at my gear, and realized the immense, crushing reality of the physical setup. The island was nothing more than a granite tooth jutting out of the North Atlantic, perpetually shrouded in dense industrial fog and battered by gales. It was geographically distant from the mainland, a journey measured in days, not hours, meaning there was no quick escape, no passing ships, and no immediate response possible in an emergency. This physical barrier was the first form of imprisonment. The brutal, unpredictable weather reinforced this captivity. The constant driving rain, the biting cold, and the relentless wind were designed to wear down more than the lighthouse tower. They were designed to wear down the human mind. The psychological effect of this perpetual environmental siege is a scientifically documented phenomenon. Cabin fever, a state of extreme psychological pressure caused by prolonged confinement and monotonous routine. I studied the records and knew the men inside had faced months of the same four walls, the same limited diet of canned goods, and the same few faces. Under such conditions, minor grievances, a misplaced tool, a comment taken wrong, a disagreement over the dwindling fuel gauge, metastasize into existential conflicts. The small enclosed space of the station meant for refuge became a pressure cooker, turning ordinary human friction into potentially lethal paranoia. The system's greatest failure was trusting human beings to endure such isolation without eventually turning on one another. Their vulnerability was not the open door. Their vulnerability was their complete, total reliance on the very small, closed circle of people sharing that confined space. On the mainland, disputes end with distance. Here, there was no distance. The enemy was the person sitting across the dinner table. This internal pressure was exacerbated by the tangible, daily fear of resource scarcity. I checked the stores, the level of canned food, the gauge on the fuel tanks, the number of distress flares remaining. In an isolated, hostile environment, these resources become more than supplies. They become weapons and symbols of control. The men's lives were regulated by the number of days left until the next supply ship could break through the storms. A supply ship that was often delayed by the very weather that defined their confinement. I knew that the minute the perceived safety of those supplies was threatened, the internal conflict would ignite. The psychological framework of the crime was simple. Isolation amplifies paranoia, and paranoia turns trust into suspicion. The evidence I found, the half-eaten meal, the open logbook, screamed that the breaking point was sudden, absolute, and that the violence was internalized. The isolation of the island ensured the perfect crime. No witnesses, no physical escape route, and a limited number of suspects already driven to the edge of human endurance. The island was a magnificent, terrifying environment, but its true horror lay in its absolute effectiveness as a psychological prison. The raw, brutal wind that day was the first thing that lied. I remember stepping off the small supply vessel onto the slick, moss-covered rocks of the island, and the true terror began when the wind stopped, replaced by a silence that proved the horror was not the sea, but what happened inside the walls. I was sent to find a simple distress signal, but I found the opposite. An absolute, unnatural stillness in a place that should have been chaotic. Our small team immediately headed for the station, the only structure visible beneath the scudding clouds. The first clue was a profound psychological shock. The building was secured, bolted against the constant gales, and the door was latched from the inside. We forced the heavy lock, and the contrast between the external gale and the internal stillness was immediate and unnerving. The interior was a terrifying tableau of suspended life. A half-eaten meal sat on the table. A book lay open on a chair marked with a pair of spectacles. The fireplace contained the faint warmth of recently banked coals. This wasn't an abandonment. It was an instantaneous, inexplicable vanishing. Every single protocol established for a sudden emergency had been violated. No distress signal had been sent. The logbook was open, the last entry made hours before, calm and mundane. But then the tone abruptly shifted in the logbook. I noticed a marked increase in paranoia and hostility in the handwriting. One entry detailed a minor argument over a dwindling supply of coffee. Another mentioned a missing tool, suggesting outright theft. One of the last legible entries made by the chief scientist wasn't about the weather at all. It was stark, trembling, and utterly chilling. The air is fine, but the trust is gone. We cannot agree on who is watching the door at night. This single sentence written in shaky ink was the undeniable omen. It confirmed that the enemy was no longer the storm or the isolation. The enemy was the man sitting across the table. The deep-seated psychological pressure of cabin fever had peaked, transforming internal distrust into genuine, existential threat. My investigation then moved to the equipment room, and I found the physical confirmation of the chief scientist's fear: the broken compass. This wasn't a navigational device for a ship. It was a simple handheld land compass used for local orientation on the island during clear days. It was found not broken by accident, but deliberately, violently smashed. The glass face was fractured, the needle bent into an unusable corkscrew. I realized the symbolic weight of the broken compass. In that environment, the compass represented direction, order, and sanity. Its deliberate destruction meant that order was no longer possible, and the group had lost its moral and perhaps physical direction. It pointed to a moment of intense, uncontrolled rage, a physical manifestation of the breakdown that the logbook only hinted at. This act of destruction, I realized, was likely the final public breaking point that preceded the vanishing. In an enclosed environment, destruction of property is never random. It's a statement. Someone had publicly rejected the routine, the structure, and the hope of maintaining sanity. The sheer anger required to smash a basic navigational tool suggests a level of frustration that had moved past rational debate and entered the realm of pure destructive impulse. The men on that island had lost their external anchor, and the broken compass was the definitive sign that the collapse was now internal. The fear was not merely confined to the chief scientist's trembling hand on the logbook. I needed to know how the other men reacted to this breakdown of order, and the logbook provided faint, terrifying clues through its negative space, the things it stopped recording. Days before the end, the detailed records of fuel consumption and wind speed, the methodical observations that governed their scientific mission, began to thin out. Entries became sparse, less precise than non-existent. This procedural lapse was the silent documentation of the crew's psychological disengagement. They were no longer scientists or caretakers. They were prisoners of their own escalating paranoia. The routine, which had been their only shield against the mind-numbing boredom, was abandoned because the internal threat was now more pressing than the external one. They stopped watching the weather because they were too busy watching each other. I deduced that after the compass was destroyed, the social structure on the island would have disintegrated completely. Without a hierarchy, without trust, and with the clear knowledge that a physical act of defiance had occurred, the confined space of the station would have become a war zone of escalating whispers. I imagined the remaining men gathering their few personal tools, their only means of self-defense, perhaps silently barricading their own sleeping quarters, isolating themselves further within the already isolated structure. The simple act of preparing a communal meal, like the half-eaten food we found, would have transformed into a tense, silent ritual, each man scrutinizing the others for any hint of poisoning or treachery. The very necessity of sharing resources, the food, the fuel, the dwindling water supply, now served only to amplify their mutual distrust. The killer knew this. The remaining personnel knew this. Their entire world was reduced to the several hundred square feet of the station walls, and the perpetrator was one of them. The destruction of the compass was the killer's way of saying, "The rules of civility are gone, and now, so is your last hope of coherent direction." The physical act of smashing the tool was the psychological turning point that set the stage for the final, immediate and utterly silent vanishing. The simple routine had been abandoned, and the silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but the terror of knowing the final act was coming. The terrifying truth of the last few hours was that the atmosphere had turned utterly toxic, and the men were fully aware they were no longer safe. The knowledge that someone within their small circle had fractured, and the lack of communication with the mainland, created a situation where the men were not just isolated by the sea, but by their mutual escalating fear of each other. The raw truth of the logbook entries and the smashed compass, the undeniable internal evidence of a psychological snap, was a heavy burden to carry back to the mainland. I left the island with a shattered piece of metal and a conviction that the system would refuse to believe me. My first challenge was not solving the crime. It was fighting the official institutional denial. I knew the mainland authorities would look at the obvious: a remote outpost, a small crew, and historically treacherous weather. Their immediate, desperate reflex was to rationalize the disaster as a simple, natural accident. They prioritized the easy lie that required no investigation: a rogue wave, a slip and fall into the churning sea, or a collective decision to take an unscheduled supply trip due to critical shortages. Anything, absolutely anything, was easier for the shipping lines and the government to accept than the terrifying conclusion that a systematic, psychological murder had occurred on their watch. I sat in the sterile, warm offices on the mainland, a stark contrast to the brutal cold of the island, and presented my findings. I showed them the logbook, pointing to the trembling final entry about the loss of trust and the fear of who was watching the door. I placed the smashed compass on the table, emphasizing that this was not accidental damage but an act of pure, destructive rage. I described the meticulous detail of the station, the half-eaten food, the secured doors, all evidence that screamed of a forced, instantaneous vanishing, not a planned departure or an accidental slip. Yet my factual psychological assessment was met with skepticism and bureaucratic inertia. They were too preoccupied with minimizing liability and avoiding the immense cost and political headache of launching a homicide investigation into a supposed haunted outpost. The official explanation became fixed. The crew must have panicked, launched the emergency boat during a sudden storm, and perished at sea. This theory was simple, clean, and placed the blame squarely on the uncontrollable weather, absolving the institution of any responsibility for the psychological welfare of its isolated personnel. My personal fight against this institutional denial became the true crisis of this phase of the investigation. I argued that the missing survival gear, a point I later had to verify, the overturned chair, and the slash mark on the wall all pointed to a struggle, not against the environment but against another man. I insisted that the lack of any distress signal was proof that the murderer was still alive at the time of the incident, preventing the last victim from alerting the outside world. I knew that the clock was working against us. Every hour spent arguing over paperwork and bureaucratic liability was an hour that the Atlantic Ocean had to claim any potential remaining evidence. The bodies, the weapon, or the final physical traces of the crime, the institutional denial, the refusal to accept that the isolation, part 2, could breed murder, ensured that the crucial early hours of the investigation, the window to find the truth, were completely wasted. The system defaulted to the safest conclusion, sacrificing the integrity of the investigation for the comfort of simplicity, leaving me with the chilling certainty that I had found a perfect crime, protected not by the killer's brilliance, but by the overwhelming, paralyzing fear of the truth. I lost the bureaucratic battle on the mainland. The easy lie of the rogue wave and the simple accident, part 4, was winning, but I refused to give up the case because I knew the truth was still on that island, hidden in the very walls they died in. I flew back with a single technician, focusing my entire investigation on the station's structural silence and the subtle evidence of desperation I had first seen. My attention was entirely drawn to the faint, deliberate slash mark I had noticed in the communications room near the filing cabinet. This was the one piece of evidence that screamed of human intent, not natural disaster. Everything else was either pristine or swept away by the sea. But this mark, a small, ragged scratch etched deep into the paint of the wooden wall, remained. This, I realized, was the final, agonizing testament of the last victim. This mark was the strange dialogue I needed to decipher. It wasn't a word but a series of scratches, deep, panicked, but ultimately controlled. It consisted of a large, clear triangle, intersected by 3 smaller, distinct vertical lines, almost like tally marks, or a distorted initial. I knew instantly that the mark was made under duress, likely by a fingernail or the sharp edge of a key, but it was too specific to be random. The last victim, knowing that escape was impossible and that the end was near, had desperately attempted to leave a final message, a last will and testament etched into the wood itself. I spent hours photographing and sketching the mark, treating it with more reverence than the official logbook. I brought in experts who specialized in analyzing duress writing and trauma-induced communication. Their consensus was chilling. The mark was made by someone who knew they had only seconds, someone trying to convey a massive amount of information in the shortest possible form. The trauma was evident in the depth of the scratches. The meaning of the symbols, however, was the true breakthrough. The 3 vertical lines were likely the simplified representation of the 3 other members of the core crew, a tally of the individuals in that confined space, part 2. But the triangle was the operational key. I reasoned that the triangle, a common symbol for stability or a fixed point, represented the rule that the killer had broken or the victim had desperately tried to uphold. After days of frustrating analysis, the psychological portrait of the island clicked into place. The final, horrifying message was not "he killed us," but a desperate warning about the system that enabled the murder. The rule, never sleep unless 2 are awake. The triangle represented the 3-person crew. The 3 vertical lines were the individuals. The message was that the safety system, the established protocol of constant vigilance required by their isolation, had failed. The murder succeeded because the established, necessary rule of mutual oversight had been broken, allowing one man to gain access to the others while they were vulnerable. The victim wasn't accusing a name. The victim was accusing the failure of the system itself. This single terrifying message fundamentally changed my investigation. It proved that the murder was an internal act, born out of the extreme paranoia and psychological collapse of a single individual who had exploited the moments of weakness, sleep, inherent in their confinement. The scratch was the ultimate evidence of betrayal, confirming that the isolated island had been the scene of a meticulously planned psychological execution, sealed by a rule the victims believed in. This tiny mark was more reliable than all the official reports combined. It gave me the necessary conviction to continue the investigation against the crushing weight of the mainland's bureaucracy. The agonizing clarity of the last victim's message, the final etched rule accusing the systemic failure of mutual oversight, gave me the conviction I needed. I knew the truth was not in the storm, but in the men. The next step in my investigation was to confront the most tangible physical contradiction I had found inside the station, the conflict between routine and panic. The rule was clearly broken, and the only remaining proof lay in what the men decided to leave behind. I returned to the main structure, focusing on the gear room and the kitchen. The immediate tension came from the kitchen counter. A half-eaten meal sat cold on the table, perhaps even a simple canned soup or stew. The ingredients were laid out, implying dinner preparation had been suddenly and violently interrupted. This suggested a moment of routine, a false sense of security that was shattered in an instant. Why would men preparing a simple meal, relying on the quiet, predictable monotony of their day, suddenly vanish unless the threat was internal and instantaneous? This half-finished mundane activity contradicted the official theory that the men had been swept away by a rogue wave. A rogue wave does not wait for the stew to cool. I then moved to the supply room, and the evidence grew starkly confusing. If the men had panicked and fled due to an unexpected emergency or external threat, they would have grabbed the heaviest coats, the full supply box, and the designated life vests. Instead, I found the heavy 3-person emergency survival suits hanging neatly on their hooks untouched. The official sealed box of distress flares was still locked away. The crucial, baffling evidence was found in what was missing and what was abandoned. We documented that only one set of light weather gear was gone, one raincoat and one pair of boots. Furthermore, the small portable radio battery, the one intended for the emergency kit, was missing. Yet the main base radio sat silent and intact. This contradiction, the half-eaten meal and the missing singular survival kit, screamed of a desperate, singular action, not a group evacuation. The missing raincoat and boots suggested that one person had left the station, or that one person had been forced out, under conditions that were not a life-or-death storm, but a quick, internal dispute. The ambiguity of the missing gear became the greatest physical paradox. Did the killer take the singular gear to make a final, permanent escape from the island? Or did the killer take the minimal gear for the immediate task of disposing of the bodies in the treacherous sea near the station? The absence of the heavy essential gear contradicted the accident theory. The absence of the men themselves contradicted the calm theory. The psychological weight of this evidence was immense. The disappearance was not an accident. It was a cold, systematic execution followed by a calculated cover-up. The killer had deliberately used the island's isolation as a weapon. He knew the investigation would default to the sea's fault theory, and he left behind just enough confusing evidence, the half-eaten meal, to support the idea that life was normal, while his missing gear ensured his immediate successful escape from the scene. The paradox of the missing gear proved that the chaos was manufactured, and the investigation's failure to accept this contradiction was the greatest institutional surrender. The paradox of the missing gear and the prepared dinner left me with a chilling certainty. The vanishing was not natural, but the result of a sudden, internal strike. The killer won the physical battle, but I knew the only remaining uncorrupted witness was the station's logbook, the methodical record of their sanity. I had reviewed the routine entries, the wind speed, the fuel consumption, the daily tasks, but now I had to search for the unseen fracture, the final words committed to paper before the silence. The crucial breakthrough came when I separated the official, public log, which was clean and mundane, from the private operational log, a smaller, loose-leaf ledger used by the chief for minute-to-minute reports. I found the truth buried in the chronological sequencing, and the words were stark, cold, and utterly terrifying. The last conventional entry detailed a standard transfer of fuel from the main tank, written in the steady, familiar hand of the chief engineer. Then on the next page the handwriting changed completely. It was shaky, urgent, and compressed, written not for records but for desperate testimony. This entry was the ultimate turning point, the precise factual documentation of the moment the psychological snap, Part 3, became physical, lethal action. The entry was short, frantic, and chillingly specific. 1940 hours, the light is out in the auxiliary room. Jay is gone. I hear the water running, but no one is in the kitchen. The radio mic is dead. He knows the rule is broken. I hear footsteps on the stairs. I don't know who is coming. This log entry confirmed everything I had previously suspected and instantly provided the timeline the mainland authorities had demanded. First, the entry confirmed the methodical nature of the threat. The power was cut. The lines of communication were severed, and the environment was plunged into darkness, all preceding the final confrontation. Second, it confirmed the internal betrayal. The author, the last victim, knew the missing man, Jay is gone, and immediately linked his absence to the threat. I hear the water running, but no one is in the kitchen. The horror was not that they were attacked by a stranger, but that the enemy was a member of their trusted, isolated unit. The true genius of the killer was revealed. He did not attack with brute force. He used psychological isolation and sabotage to render the last survivor helpless, before physically striking. The final words, "I hear footsteps on the stairs," a sound that, in their isolation, should have been comforting, became the terrifying signal of the end. The discovery of this hidden log entry ended the political debate. I now had the factual proof needed to open the murder investigation, but the knowledge was a terrible isolating burden. This final entry proved that the crew's safety system, the established rule of mutual oversight, had been systematically dismantled from within, leaving the last man fully exposed to the silent, calculated terror of a predator who had been living and working alongside him for months. This single trembling entry was the final unchallengeable testimony that the silence of the sea was a lie. The island had become a tomb designed by human hands. I held the proof of the crime in my hands, the final desperate log entry confirming the internal sabotage. But the island wasn't finished with its victims yet. I felt a sudden, profound drop in the barometric pressure, a heavy shift in the air that was more menacing than any wind I had encountered before. Within minutes of finding that final entry, the exterior of the station was plunged into a chaotic white fury. The sea, which had been merely brutal, turned instantly malevolent, erupting into a mountainous, terrifying churn. The wind was no longer a constant roar. It was a screaming physical presence that threatened to tear the skin from the bones of the granite structure. This immediate, drastic environmental shift was the final trap. The island was claiming me as its own. The radio crackled and died. Our small supply vessel, which was waiting in the lee of the island to extract us, was forced to make a desperate run for safety, leaving us completely cut off from the mainland. I was suddenly and terrifyingly alone with the crime scene, trapped in the very psychological prison that had broken the original crew. The crisis was no longer an abstract problem to be solved with files and forensics. It was my immediate personal survival. I moved through the station, securing the doors and listening to the unbelievable force of the Atlantic outside, and I felt the psychological contagion begin to set in. The wind, screaming through the vents, sounded like 1,000 voices, not ghosts, but the audible manifestation of raw fear and isolation. I realized with sickening clarity that the storm was amplifying the internal terror. Every creak of the aging metal, every shudder of the lighthouse structure, felt like a footstep on the stairs, a reminder that the murderer, though gone, had perfected his method in this very place. The procedural paralysis was absolute. I held the log entry, the proof of murder, but it was worthless. I could not transmit the information. I could not call for military intervention, and I could not leave. I was now hostage to the very environment that had shielded the killer. Part 2. My mind began to race, focusing obsessively on the same elements that drove the original crew to madness. The dwindling supplies, the continuous monotony, the confined space. I struggled to maintain my objective focus, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder, fighting the deep-seated impulse to believe that the perpetrator, the man who knew the station's weaknesses intimately, was still on the island, protected by the gale. My greatest fear was not the sea. It was the realization that I was beginning to experience the psychological contamination that preceded the breakdown. I had to fight to keep the investigation factual. My only mission was to ensure the physical evidence, the logbook, the broken compass, the photographic proof of the slash mark, Part 7, survived the storm. I wrapped the crucial evidence, sealing it against the damp and the salt, knowing that if the structure failed, the truth would be lost forever. I was no longer an objective investigator. I was the temporary caretaker of a crime committed decades ago, now fighting the same elements that guaranteed the killer's escape and the institutional denial, Part 4. The island, I realized, was an active, ongoing threat. A perfect killer that waited patiently for human psychological exhaustion before claiming its next victim. The terrifying beauty of the system was complete. The isolation caused the breakdown, and the subsequent storm ensured the crime remained a secret of the sea. The storm raged, isolating me completely and mirroring the exact terrifying psychological pressure that destroyed the original crew. I held the logbook, I had the broken compass, but I still needed the why, the core mechanism that turned fear into lethal action. The storm did not just isolate me, it forced me to see the killer's exact breaking point. I realized the crime was not caused by a ghost or even a singular political motive. It was caused by the predictable human collapse of a mind under extreme duress. My job was to deduce the killer's own rule, the simple final logic that led him to murder his companions. I systematically ruled out the easy answers. This was not a crime of simple robbery. Nothing of value was systematically taken. This was not a crime of passion or sexual violence. The evidence did not support it. The motive was deeper, more primal, rooted in the shared physical confinement of the island. Part 2. I concluded that the killer's breakdown was caused by resource paranoia. The logbook, Part 3, showed the escalating anxiety over dwindling coffee and missing tools. In an isolated environment where life depends on limited supplies, trust evaporates quickly. The killer, suffering from severe cabin fever and psychological isolation, came to believe that the only way to survive the next storm, the next month, or the next year was to eliminate the competition. His internal logic became, the rule is that only one can survive the next winter, and that one must be me. This terrifying logical conclusion explains the meticulous nature of the crime. The killer didn't just strike in a fit of rage. He executed a preemptive, systematic action to secure all remaining supplies and silence any potential witness. His violence was a twisted form of self-preservation. The murder was likely triggered by a seemingly minor event, a small argument over duty, a perceived slight, or the sudden, uncontrollable impulse to secure the last remaining ration. The destruction of the compass was the final public declaration that he was abandoning the communal contract and embracing his own rule of survival. The subsequent actions support this cold logic. The missing singular piece of light weather gear, Part 6, suggests that the killer immediately prepared for a specific task, the disposal of the bodies in the treacherous waters surrounding the station. He wasn't attempting to flee the island. He was eliminating the physical evidence of his desperate, calculated attempt at self-preservation. The ultimate act of the crime was not the taking of life, but the complete methodical erasure of the evidence, forcing the authorities to default to the simple, non-investigable truth of disappeared at sea. The killer had to maintain the illusion of an accident, guaranteeing that the island would remain his. I was overcome by the grim realization the crime was utterly predictable and entirely preventable. It was born from the failure of the system to recognize that extreme isolation is a weapon that inevitably turns inward. The perpetrator was not a monster. He was a human mind pushed past its breaking point, reverting to the most basic, brutal rule of existence. The only horror on this island was the devastating, chilling predictability of human psychological collapse. I knew the killer's mind, I understood his terrifying rule of survival, but the sea held the only physical proof, and it wasn't letting go. My victory in deducing the psychological motive was immediately nullified by the vast, cold reality of the North Atlantic. I returned to the mainland, clutching the wrapped evidence, the logs, the fragmented compass, the photographs of the scratch mark, and presented my case. This was a murder, born from psychological collapse and fear of resource scarcity, not a weather accident. The official response, however, was still rooted in the logic of liability and denial that had plagued the initial hours of the case. Part 4. They preferred the simple lie that required no further effort. They needed bodies. I had only motives and shattered equipment. The immediate investigation became a desperate, futile race against the ocean itself. I supervised the subsequent air and sea searches, knowing the chances were minuscule. The North Atlantic is not a lake. It is a limitless grave. We spent days charting the treacherous currents, sending out calls to every passing vessel, hoping for a fragment of the emergency boat, a piece of clothing, or, impossibly, the remains of the crew. But the ocean, indifferent and vast, offered nothing. The resources allocated were minimal, a mere gesture of bureaucratic compliance, because the system had already delivered its internal verdict: disappeared at sea. The institutional belief was fixed on the rogue wave rationalization, and no amount of psychological profiling or logbook evidence could overcome the lack of corpus delicti. This was the ultimate act of survival for the institution. They chose to officially close the case as a tragic accident, a non-investigable event caused by the environment. This decision absolved the authorities of the responsibility of admitting that their isolation protocol had failed, and that they had left men in a psychological pressure cooker. The failure to secure a conviction was sealed not by the killer's brilliance, but by the overwhelming logistical impossibility of proving a murder without a body. My evidence, the terrifying internal truth about the killer's own rule, was deemed inadmissible against the simple, powerful lie of nature's violence. The cost was immense. The system protected itself, and the killer, whether still alive in the world or lost to the very waves that covered his crime, achieved permanent legal impunity. The final verdict, delivered by the cold silence of the sea, was that the island's isolation was the perfect, final accomplice. The terrifying burden of the truth remains locked within my memory, and the sealed evidence boxes, a constant personal reminder that I solved the crime, but failed to deliver justice. The bureaucratic verdict was delivered: accident at sea. The institutional judgment, rooted in the legal inability to prosecute a crime without a body, closed the files, but the silence did not bring peace. The sea may have won the case, but the island lost its silence forever, and the legacy I carried away was the profound psychological scar left by the truth the public refused to believe. The unsolved nature of the vanishing, coupled with the documented facts of a sudden, instant departure, immediately created a fertile ground for myth. The public rejected the mundane, easy lie of the rogue wave and demanded a spectacular explanation for the disappearance of 3 men from a secured post. The story was instantly and irrevocably converted from a human tragedy into a supernatural one. The isolation of the island, the very condition that had birthed the psychological collapse de martyr. First, it was now used to validate the haunting. The island's severe weather, the strange acoustics, and the sense of deep, unending loneliness were psychologically transferred onto the narrative, turning factual environmental stress into malevolent spirits and unseen forces. The public found it easier to accept that the crew was dragged away by a mythical force than to accept the stark, brutal reality that one of them, a normal human being pushed past the breaking point by isolation and resource paranoia, had killed the others and disposed of the evidence. Part 10. The psychological transfer was complete. The human horror of the internal struggle was packaged as a more comforting, manageable ghost story. The enduring power of this legacy, however, is not the ghost stories but the final, silent message I found etched into the wall. The rule that remained, the victim's frantic scratching that demanded mutual oversight, Part 5, became the island's permanent, factual haunting. That message, that final plea against psychological isolation, is the truth I carry. It is the real, terrifying legacy of the place. The scratched mark on the wall is the permanent, irrefutable evidence of the failure of the system to look after the minds of its isolated personnel. It stands as a timeless warning about the fragility of human sanity when the natural boundaries of interaction and trust are systematically removed. The final irony of the legacy is that the island, now cemented in folklore as haunted, continues to attract attention and tourism precisely because the legal verdict was incomplete. The public continues to visit, seeking the ghosts that I know are merely the echoes of human paranoia. But in their search, they keep the true, dark story alive. My truth, that the killer's internal rule of survival destroyed the crew, is relegated to the dusty archives, while the profitable, easier story of the sea spirits reigns supreme. My failure to secure the conviction, Part 10, guaranteed the killer's anonymity, but it also guaranteed the island's enduring fame, proving that in the end, the captivating lie always travels further than the difficult truth. The files are closed, the search parties have returned empty-handed, and the island now sits secured by the official verdict of accident at sea. Yet, the ultimate legacy is not the spirits the public seeks. It's the chilling, undeniable truth of what the island did to the men who thought they could conquer it. My investigation led me to one single factual conclusion. The true horror of this island was its absolute isolation, which amplified every human flaw until the mind itself fractured. The sea did not kill these men. The psychological pressure created by the system killed them. The official verdict, rooted in institutional denial and the legal inability to prosecute a crime without a body, remains the final, structural lie of the case. I carry the burden of the evidence, knowing that the simple, cold truth is far more terrifying than any ghost story the media could ever invent. The crime was utterly predictable, born from the established psychological mechanism of cabin fever and resource paranoia. We knew, based on the internal logs, that the men's mental states were deteriorating rapidly, fueled by the monotony and the lack of communication. The external environment, the endless wind, the fog, the physical confinement, was the perfect killer, systematically eroding their trust until one of them reverted to the most primal, desperate survival mechanism. Eliminate the competition, Part 9. The silence I found was the imposed, perfect result of this psychological breakdown. The rule that remained, the victim's final, frantic etching demanding mutual oversight, is the enduring factual ghost of this island. That scratch on the wall is not a warning about a malevolent force. It is the ultimate testament to the failure of the human contract. The rule was established to ensure no single person could ever gain enough control to become a threat. And the moment that rule was broken, the system collapsed. The killer exploited their weakness, their temporary lapse in vigilance. And the system failed because it prioritized the structural integrity of the lighthouse over the mental integrity of the men inside. My personal verdict is that this case is not a historical anomaly. It is a profound lesson in human vulnerability. The island stands as a perpetual monument to the danger of neglecting mental health in isolated positions. The public prefers to believe in the haunted house myth, Part 11, because it provides a comforting external threat. A ghost is manageable. The reality, that the darkness came from within, from the ordinary human mind under extreme, sustained pressure, is too devastating to accept. The greatest service I can provide is to continuously fight that convenient fiction, affirming that the ultimate horror is human. The ultimate closure for me is the understanding that the murderer, though escaping the clutches of the law, has been identified. The isolation. The island itself delivered the final, cold verdict, proving that its unique geographical and psychological structure was the perfect crime lab. The case of the abandoned island is the starkest warning I have ever filed. The bodies were never found. The killer remains unknown to the law, but the truth is evident in the silence. The final question I leave you with is this. In your own moments of deepest isolation, where would you have looked for the killer? Outside the locked door or across the dinner table? Let me know your final thoughts on the psychological cost of the sea and the meaning of the rule "the last victim" left behind in the comments below. If you dare to delve deeper into the terrifying intersection of true crime and psychological isolation, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The lesson of the island must never be forgotten.